Easily one of the most venerable game franchises is Halo, and it did see a transition last year with Halo 4 being made by 343 Industries, taking on the mantle after Bungie moved on to Activision. I had a chance to sit down with the creative director for the franchise, Josh Holmes, to learn more about the transition. Happen to be joined by Josh Holmes, the franchise creative director at 343 Industries, the makers of, the new makers of the Halo franchise. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
Congratulations on Halo 4. I haven't gotten a chance to see you. Now that you've had some sort of distance from it, you guys really took on like one of the biggest franchises in gaming. There's a lot of eyes on you. You were a new studio. Did that journey from where it started to where it ended, did it have the trajectory that you expected?
I think when we started on that journey, we all knew that it would kind of work out one of two ways. It would either be a big success or a colossal train wreck, and go down in industry legend. So, but I mean, in all seriousness, we brought together an amazing team from all across the industry, just incredible talent, and everybody that signed on knew the challenge that we were taking on and how daunting that was to be taking over this beloved franchise from this storied developer and trying to tell the next chapter.
I always wondered at one point, this is before the game came out, that because the pressure was so great, that I knew you, I knew Frank O'Connor, that you guys might actually overcompensate and really, really kind of knock it out of the park. I mean, were you so focused on just really trying to stay true that, I'm just curious, how much of the greater context was always in the back of your head?
I mean, there was pressure on us every day, and I lived this game for 3 years of my life. I didn't see my family very much. I didn't see my friends. This was the thing that consumed me each and every day, and it's all I really thought about. I think that drive, that passion was there for people all across the team.
Let's talk about the story, because I really thought it was one of the strongest Halo stories, probably the strongest since the first Halo games.
Thank you.
You were also having to sort of start a new narrative, but also respect the old one. And it looks like the most prominent through line is Cortana, and that relationship suddenly going very awry.
Yeah, I mean, it was really challenging because you have this story that's already in motion with the previous games, and then you have all of this surrounding fiction that's going on. And early on, Frank and I talked about ways that we would approach the storytelling, and we decided very deliberately to connect everything, which is crazy, because it's just complicated and it's a lot to keep in your head and kind of maintain. And so we had to be really deliberate in trying to compartmentalize different parts of the storytelling to make sure that each of those parts was satisfying in and of itself. But in approaching the Master Chief storyline, we knew that we wanted to evolve him as a character. We wanted to put him in circumstances where he couldn't just overcome any obstacle, and he would have to kind of get in touch with his own humanity. And the way to do that was in exploring that relationship with Cortana, which was a huge challenge in an action game like Halo.
Well, and also, I mean, Master Chief as a character is one of the most, if not the most enduring. Maybe he and Lara Croft are the two most enduring characters. And his character, when it was first established in the first Halo, was also sort of a product of how shooters were made at the time and what the technology really could afford them. And so he wasn't very drawn out.
He's not very defined, yeah.
And that must have been somewhat challenging to try to start to color in between these lines that had been established so long ago.
Yeah, we talked a lot about this as a team, and if you look at the way that Chief has been portrayed in the games, he's I call him a vessel. There's a great GDC talk that Matthias Warch gave a couple years ago where he defined it as kind of like a puppet versus a vehicle. Anyway, Chief is very much on that. In past games has very much been on the side of being a puppet or a vessel that the player can kind of pour themselves into this empty shell and inhabit it. And we wanted to move him more into the middle, what I call a marriage between the player and the protagonist, and bring some of that richer detail that exists in the surrounding work of the universe and the novels, where he has an actual backstory, he has definition as a character. Bring that in, but at the same time, find the right balance where we're not at any time violating the player's intent.
And I think the easier approach could have been sort of Cortana reacting to him. And instead you did something far more sophisticated where you're trying to define Chief against the idea that Cortana and her personality is sort of dissembling in front of your eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we started talking through, we had these two storylines that needed to coexist. The kind of, we call the A storyline, which is Chief saves the galaxy and overcomes the Didact and the Promethean threat. And that's kind of what's playing on the front stage. But underlying all of that is this quieter story between these two characters with Chief and Cortana, and her struggle to deal with her rampancy, and she's losing her mind and dealing with her own mortality, and Chief's realizing that his bigger challenge is, can he not just save the galaxy, but can he save his friend? And when we started out on that journey and talked about that story, there were times where as a team we were like, maybe we can't tell this story. And I remember having discussions with Chris Schlurf, who's the lead writer on the campaign, and he was pulling his hair out like, I don't know how to tell this story, like maybe we can't do this. And we just fought through it. I really believe that this was the emotional heart of the story that we wanted to tell, and I think it ended up being probably the strongest part of our campaign storyline.
And there also was that aspect of Chief having some self-discovery, or at least you as the player having some discovery about Master Chief and sort of his human origins.
Absolutely, and I mean, this is the first time in a Halo game where Chief has actually made decisions for himself, where he hasn't just followed orders blindly. And the change is subtle, because he's such a stalwart character, and he's been so much of, he's almost like Clint Eastwood. He's a rock. He shows very little on the surface, and so moving him just a few degrees is a big deal as a character. But that was important to us.
And I think many people have said that some of the later Halo games, 2 and 3, and I think some of Reach, got a little oblique in terms of the narrative. Is Gravemind showing up. I'm like, well, hold on, what just happened here?
Yeah.
And you were just referencing that there is a lot of meta narrative stuff that isn't coming exactly out of the game. That's got to be a tough one, because you have to be able to tell the story within the game, but then for those who are just the diehard fans, help populate it with all the other fiction that surrounds it.
Yeah, it's a really tough balance when you're universe building and you have all of this surrounding narrative that you want to tie into and you want to kind of respect and reflect, but you need to keep it self-contained enough that it's satisfying within the game, and you never have players feeling like they have to go outside the game to really understand what's going on. And I think for the most part we did a really good job of that. There is a character in the Didact who's the main adversary, where there's a lot of surrounding fiction that has been developed with the Greg Bear Forerunner trilogy, and he's a complex character. He's got a lot of nuanced motivations that I think we allowed that to bleed a little bit too far into the main game narrative, which then caused players, as they're playing through it, to feel like, okay, what am I missing? I got to go and read the books now to understand what's going on. I got to watch the terminals. And so I think, in hindsight, I would like to have done a better job of simplifying that part of the narrative.
And also, I mean, there's always that risk, and especially in game narrative, of that diehard effect, where it's like, how can bad things keep on happening?
Yeah.
And I think in the case of Halo, it's how could there be another Halo? And that must have been very delicate, how you actually will justify its title by having the titular object actually have a presence in there, because it seems so resolved at the end of Halo 3.
Yeah, I mean, you're constantly having to kind of up the stakes and come up with that next great threat, because Halo is a story and a fantasy about heroics, being the hero that will save us all. But I think more interesting than that is when you kind of explore the personal stakes, and that's where the Cortana story really came in, because Chief can go and save the galaxy any number of times, and that's a great fantasy to live out. But after a while, it doesn't have the same impact. Whereas the idea of him trying to save his friend and losing someone that is really dear to him, and realizing that he can't necessarily save everybody all the time, that to me at least is a much more interesting thing to explore.
And the introduction of the Prometheans, new enemy. I mean, it had been, the games there was the Covenant, there was the Flood.
Yeah.
Was it kind of liberating to get to play with something new? I would guess just in character design, it must have given you guys some freedom.
It was liberating. It was also scary and and frustrating at times, because we wanted to create an enemy that was that would stand up to the Covenant. The Covenant has been this amazing adversary that you've had throughout this entire series. We wanted to create something that lived up to that legacy and yet was very different. It wasn't just kind of reskinning existing behaviors. And the process that we went through as a team, both on the mechanics side, prototyping and working through mechanics, and then also on the visual design side, was very painful because we iterated on those suckers for, it felt like the entire life cycle of the game production. We rebuilt the Knight literally 3 times from scratch, just because we weren't happy with the results that we were getting.
Were you kind of finding that you're creating too many equities between Covenant enemies and the enemies that you made on the Prometheans?
There were times where we would take a behavior and say, okay, we need to change this because it is too similar. But no, I think it was, there are a couple of things that were challenging for us. One was early on in prototyping, I don't think we were clear enough about exactly what the success criteria of each of the prototypes were. Like we kind of had vague goals that we wanted to achieve. They need to be dynamic, they need to be collaborative, they need to be fun, but we weren't being crisp enough in the way that we were kind of judging for that. And then on the visual side, we had a back and forth in terms of what would lead. Like, are they going to be led more by the fiction? Are they going to be led more by mechanical needs? Are they going to be led more just by pure visual design? And again, getting really clear as to what the priority was there was the key for us being successful.
Well, then also in these very large battles, you had a large catalog of enemies because you were going to have Prometheans and you're going to have Covenant in the same place. I mean, what was that challenge like? I mean, you must have discovered some matchups that just weren't really going to work well for the player.
Yeah, well, actually, it was kind of the inverse, where there were some situations we knew we were going to have elites and grunts and jackals fighting alongside knights. One of the happy accidents that we had was when one of our mission designers put together hunters and watchers and saw the gameplay that kind of emerged from that and what it was like to have a hunter now have this being that's shielding him, and just some of the things that emerged as we combined enemies together in creating engagements was really interesting and led to some unexpected fun.
I have to ask, I mean, from the get-go, were the Flood off the table, or was that something that was entertained sometime during the 3-year cycle?
I mean, we definitely talked about it. We talked about, does the Flood come back in this game? Didn't make sense from a story perspective, and I think there was a lot of trepidation amongst the team just in terms of the Flood as an enemy and how exhausting they could become at times and kind of monotonous as an enemy to fight. So pretty early on, we kind of put that off the table and said, yeah, that's not something that we're going to be pursuing. I think if we had chosen to pursue the Flood, if that had entered into the story somehow, we would have had to do some major reinvention of what that encounter would play out like.
So I guess in looking back, I mean, how much learning from Halo 4 are you now going to be applying to what's going to be happening down the line?
I mean, I think we learned a ton as a team. I mean, we learned how to work together. As a brand new team, you've got people who have never been in the trenches together, and they've got to learn to trust one another, and they've got to learn what each individual's strength is. And so that was an amazing process. I think as a brand new team taking over Halo, we had to walk a very fine line between familiarity and reinvention. We couldn't go so far astray that we would lose the existing audience and player base, and yet we wanted to continue to push things forward and take risks and explore new ways of telling stories and creating experiences like Spartan Ops. And those are some of the experiments that we'll definitely take learnings from and apply in the future.
Well, I can't wait to see what you guys do, and you guys really do deserve the mantle of the Halo franchise.
Thanks so much for your time. Thank you.